Jimmy Lai for many, many years. Why do you think the Chinese Communist Party and the Hong Kong government are focusing so much on him?
Well, he is an extraordinary man. So there's a reason that he's seen as the kind of black hand mastermind. I think it's unfair, but look, he's one of the most successful entrepreneurs of his generation in Hong Kong. He's not just one of 10,000 great Hong Kong entrepreneurs. He is really one of the best. And he had a lot of money. He was a billionaire before they started destroying him and his fortune. So number one, rich businessman. Number two, he had a big media platform. In the space of 20 years, he built one of the most powerful media organizations in the Chinese-speaking world. And number three, which is perhaps the most difficult for the Chinese Communist Party to deal with, he's a man of principles. He's a man of deep, deep religious faith. But beyond that, he's a man who believes in freedom, and he's willing to go to the mat, even if it means sacrificing his life. So the combination, that trifecta, the money, the media, and the principles, mean that he's a kind of force that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, doesn't really know how to deal with. And the fact that Jimmy is opposed to them and above all pro-freedom means that just given who they are, they have no choice but to destroy him. It's kind of in their DNA to try to destroy people like Jimmy.
Do you think there was a point when, the writing eventually was on the wall about what was happening in Hong Kong, especially with the national security law in 2020? Was there ever a moment where it was like, okay, either Jimmy Lai has to back down or stay on this path? Like, was there ever a way out for him?
Well, it's interesting. I first met Jimmy in 1993. I profiled him when I was at the Far Eastern Economic Review, and we stayed in pretty close touch. I knew him over the years. I was on the board of directors of his media company. But I think the die was cast back in 1994, coincidentally. He wrote a piece for Next Magazine, the magazine he founded right after the Tiananmen Square killings, where he attacked the premier of China, Li Peng, called him a butcher of Beijing, called him all sorts of bad things. Very intemperate language. And this was on the occasion of Li Peng's first trip to the West since the Tiananmen massacre. And at that point, the Chinese authorities started really focusing their attention on Jimmy, and they started shutting the stores of his Giordano clothing chain. One of the most successful, is kind of the precursor of fast fashion of companies like Uniqlo. They started shutting his stores in Beijing. Oh, you don't have a license. Oh, we got a safety problem. All sorts of the usual nonsense. And they thought Jimmy would back down. I mean, every other businessman that they deal with backs down. Jimmy didn't back down. He said, I'll sell the company. He sold the clothing company and never looked back. And so I think the die was kind of cast in 1994. Now, of course, there were many, many times Jimmy could have taken a different path. He could have not started the newspaper. He could have said, wow, a magazine's enough trouble. I don't need a newspaper. Started a fabulously successful newspaper. As time went on, I think he became, more and more convinced of the justice of his position really for freedom. And many people talked to him about leaving. And he said, I would rather be hanging from a lamppost in central Hong Kong than give the communists the satisfaction of saying that I ran away. I mean, it's just the kind of guy he is. Most of us aren't really wired like that, but that's who he is.
Wow.
It's interesting just thinking about someone who, lives a billionaire lifestyle and such a luxurious life, and then they're in like a prison cell, probably a lot of solitary confinement, but just like these gray concrete drab walls. I just like to go from that to that it's very hard for most people to deal with.
Well, I don't think really any of us, he's kind of, I don't know, 1 in a million, 1 in a billion in some senses. Nobody else like him in China. It is, I'm sure it's incredibly hard physically, but it fits the kind of path that he's taken. I mean, he, as a young man, he came as a penniless immigrant escaping famine in China. He was 12 years old. His mother said, go to Hong Kong. He was right over the border in China. Go to Hong Kong, you'll probably starve. This is a time when 45 million people were starving to death in China. So he left that kind of famine And he found first freedom he found was just food. He said he woke up the next day in Hong Kong. There's all this rice, there's dumplings, there's food. He was sleeping on a factory floor when he moved there. 15 years later, he owned a factory. And so first there's the freedom of food. Then there was the freedom of business success and eventually a very sybaritic, libertine lifestyle. I mean, he famously had a pet bear in his house, his mansion, when I first met him in the early 90s. But in Hong Kong, and chauffeured Rolls Royce. I mean, a whole menagerie besides the pet bear, peacocks, flying fox, all sorts of things. A crazy life. And then he got more and more committed to the cause of democracy, and along the way converted to Catholicism. And in a way, it's a very fitting life that he's leading now. But I certainly don't mean to make light of it, because you mentioned solitary confinement. He's been in prison consecutively more than 1,400 days. Almost all of that time he's been in solitary confinement. You think about that. It's a place. Here's a guy who used to drink the best Bordeaux wine. Eat whatever. He's a real food lover, whether it's truffles or char siu, barbecued pork in Hong Kong. And so he went from living just a life where he could have whatever he wanted to one where his every movement is regulated by the prison authorities. He can't choose when to turn his light on, let alone when or what he can eat. It's all regulated. And yet within that, I think he's found freedom. His reading is almost exclusively, I think it is exclusively Catholic theological works. He paints a lot. He's self-taught. Well, not completely self-taught, because he did study art. Does a lot of paintings, all religious themed. Christ on the cross, the Virgin Mary. So within he prays a lot. He has to do prison labor. So it's quite a journey, but from everything we can tell, he's spiritually and mentally very, very free. However, it is taking a real physical toll on him. I mean, he's 76 years old. He had diabetes when he went into prison. Since then, he's had COVID, suffered COVID during his prison stay. He's had a cataract operation. I don't want to say it was botched, but it was done in a prison hospital. And by all accounts, he can't really see very well anymore. So he's lost a lot of weight. Authorities won't even allow photographers to take a picture of him. The last image we've seen was taken surreptitiously by Associated Press photographer back in the summer of 2023. But by all accounts, he's in court now, and he's apparently lost a lot of weight. Yeah, he's 76. I mean, I think anybody would be suffering, but you go through that kind of hardship at that age with pre-existing health conditions, and it's rough.
I think just a quick digression, but I think it's always interesting with a story like Jimmy Lai. Part of the communist message is that capitalism and all these billionaires are oppressive and they keep the people down. But in a story like him, like you see, he fled communism where he was starving, became successful, and became this great person. And then again, communism comes back and oppresses.
It's totally ironic. And yeah, I think most of us would have left. I left. I mean, and I wasn't in as much danger as he was. It's unbelievable. But the story of Jimmy Lai is really the story of Hong Kong, and that's why. I mean, he is kind of chosen to take on kind of the suffering of the Hong Kong people in a way. I mean, he said, kind of like, I got you. I helped get you into this. I'm not leaving now. But the story of people fled China after the 1949 Communist Revolution because they didn't want to be starving. They didn't want to be oppressed. Hong Kong got a couple of million refugees over the years. It got, I think, about 3 or 4 million people who fled communist China. Then China comes back in 1997 when the British left the colony and turned it over to the Chinese. All sorts of wonderful promises about how Hong Kong was going to be freer than ever. Its existing way of life would stay the same. And instead, here we are again, 75 years after the birth of the Chinese Communist Revolution, and they've smothered Hong Kong from, as you say, people who fled that very system and whose kids grew up in an atmosphere and a spirit of freedom, expecting more freedom, expecting democracy. And instead, they're just being smothered by a thuggish authoritarian government. It's just unbelievable.